So now we're going to start our first session, which is entitled Impact. And it will be moderated by Alejandra Dubcovsky, who just walked in, Associate Professor of History, and part of the Fall 2018 Contested History Seminar, and Howard Wettstein, Professor of Philosophy, and part of the Spring 2018 Religious Identities Seminar. So I will turn it over to them.
I'm coming from class. That ends at 9:30. I'm literally right here.
Wow. Okay, so I'll just introduce the first speaker, and
Sure.
we'll trade off. We had a session on religious identity last spring, and it was fantastic for me. And one of the highlights was our current speaker, Hassanah. So she's going to speak about female Muslim embodiment. So please join us. And wherever you'd rather sit or stand.
Do I start the presentation now, or?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Where would you prefer?
Because my slide is supposed to come up.
It's on the desktop.
Oh, great. Yeah, here's good. I'm actually going to move that.
So I have a story to introduce Hassanah with. I just thought of. I just told Catherine the story. Last year, we met, and the faculty were leading the discussions. We took turns, and so it was on a Tuesday. It was the day after Trump had moved the American embassy to Jerusalem. It was a very upsetting day for me as a Jew and for you as a Muslim, I'm sure. And it was also Nakba Day, which is commemorating what Palestinians feel, understandably, as a catastrophe. It's the same day that Israelis see as Independence Day, so it's a really ironic and horrible and who knows what. It's heavy. And I started thinking about you and your family because you had left. They had been excluded from Gaza in '48, if I remember right. And I thought, you must be feeling something really strong today. So I thought you should start the discussion. And you said, okay, if you talk about Israel. And I thought, this is peace. We're actually talking across these things, and it's kind of wonderful. So,
Thank you for that introduction. I mean, it really was a delight to be able to work together with Professor Howie and Dr. Katya. It's always strange because when you work with them, then you drop the doctor, right? But then when you're in these formal occasions, you got to put the doctor in. I mean, my mom is Dr. Jane. Until today, I call her Dr. Jane. You know, like you work so hard for that degree, you know. But I'm really glad to be here today. Thank you all, especially Catherine and everyone who has been working tirelessly to put this event together. So my talk is, as you can see, about female Muslim embodiment and the way combating Islamophobia through fashion. The particular interdisciplinary focus that I applied for the AIS was religious identity. So understanding what it means to embody religious identity. What is religious identity? I'm particularly talking about how Muslim women identify themselves religiously. Okay, so this talk has an emphasis on that. Now, I want to preface that with just kind of a brief lay of the land in terms of American-Muslim relations through the lens of Islamophobia and understanding that, and then segue into what I mean by female Muslim embodiment. What does that even mean? Okay. So generally, I always like to start with like an Islam 101, but in the interest of time, I think I'm not going to be able to do that just because I practiced yesterday and I went over time, so I'm going to have to. But I usually do that because I assume generally that my audience knows at least basic core tenets about Islam, only come to find that that's not usually the case. So I'd like to kind of rectify that. But hopefully, you know, on your own, you can have time to just revisit that. So the way that I like to demonstrate Islamophobia in its current state right now, and I'm talking particularly from 2014 until its current moment, is through the FBI hate crime statistics. Since the 1990s, the FBI, they tabulate the hate crimes geared toward Americans, and they categorize it through different racial, religious, ethnic, and sexual orientation categorizations. And I'm looking at here specifically the amount of hate crimes geared toward Muslims that are religiously inspired. And when you look at the statistics, in 1 year, anti-Muslim hate crimes rose 67% from 154 hate crimes in 2014 to 257 in 2015. And then there was another great spike to 307 hate crimes in 2016, and then it went down a little in 2017 to 273 hate crimes. Now, this was, the 2016 was the highest level of hate crime since 9/11. In 9/11, it was about 481 hate crimes. Now, please remember that these numbers are just the crimes that have been reported. Of course, there are so many other crimes that go unreported and unrecognized. And what happens with these anti-Muslim hate crimes is that Muslim women often have to bear the brunt of that. And that's because many of them are visibly Muslim, right? They walk with this kind of, those who don the headscarf, it's kind of on their sleeve, so to speak, that they are Muslim. And so there have been many reports of them walking in a parking lot and someone just yanking their headscarf off or say, go back home. And a funny one was, you mean Michigan? I was born in Michigan. I love that one. And so, again, and we're going to talk today about what it means to be visibly Muslim and what that's like. This is the statistics from, this is the chart from 2016, and I want you to pay attention to the top 3 religious orientations that have received the most hate crimes. It's number 1, anti-Jewish hate crimes, number 2, anti-Muslim hate crimes, and then number 3, anti-Catholic. Now that's going to be important for a Pew study that I'm going to tell you about in the next slide. So just pay attention here. The top 3 anti-religious crimes against Muslims were in America, Jews, then Muslims, and then Catholics. So we know that right when we see this spike in or in Islamophobia at large, we know that there's a correlation to the presidential campaigns. And particularly, with the Trump administration that ushered in kind of the making it socially acceptable to be overtly Islamophobic and not be held accountable for certain slurs against Muslims, Muslim life, particularly Muslim women. We know that once President Donald Trump was elected, just within 10 days, the Southern Poverty Law Center counted 867 cases of hateful harassment and intimidation toward Muslims. Now this runs the gamut. Many mosques across the nation would receive letters of genocide, would receive threatening letters, would wake up to swastikas on the doors of these mosques, even here in California. Again, Muslim women's headscarves being torn off. And then we start to see this manifest even structurally, right, with the Muslim ban version 1, 2, and 3. And just brief statement from what some of these letters, these very ominous letters that were left at mosques across the nation said, and I can read it here. There's a new sheriff in town, President Donald Trump. He is going to cleanse America and make it shine again, and he's going to start with you Muslims. He's going to do to you Muslims what Hitler did to the Jews. You Muslims would be wise to pack your bags and get out of Dodge. Right, this was said by, the letter was by a group called Americans for a Better Way, and this was actually here in California, left in mosques here in California, so not too far from where we're at. Now, this is an interesting study done by Pew that can put a lot of things into perspective. They surveyed over 4,000 adults, asking them to rate how they feel toward a variety of different religious faith groups on a feeling thermometer, meaning that the warmer you felt, the more kind of at ease you were with that religion, and then the cooler they felt, the more kind of antagonistic and less uncomfortable they felt with that religion. And to no surprise, of course, Muslims were rated the coolest in terms of the feeling thermometer. And what's interesting about this is that Americans are saying that that they don't feel comfortable around around Muslims, but ironically, they say that the survey showed that it was the Jews and the Catholics that people felt the most favorable and the warmest to. Now, do you remember when I showed you the hate crime statistics of 2016? The Jews and the Catholics were receiving the most amount of hate, correct? But this survey, done almost around the same time, saying that that they actually are experiencing warmth and glad tidings, right? Which is kind of interesting, thinking about just putting that into perspective. But what the study also showed, which is kind of the main thing here that I want to emphasize, is you see the last line here where it says that almost 60% of Americans said that they actually don't know someone who's Muslim. So that is very interesting, that they rated Muslims they felt the coolest toward, meaning that they felt the least comfortable around, despite not even knowing a Muslim. So that gives you an idea of the level of xenophobia, right, that is happening here. Now, how has this been combated by Muslims and even non-Muslims? And I really draw a lot of inspiration from our own Dr. Riza Aslan from here, the creative writing department, who said, I mean, he was kind of the poster child, the spokesperson for Muslims on cable news. And I noticed that then he was no longer showing up on all of these interviews. And then he released a statement saying that the reason why he wasn't taking those interviews on cable news anymore was because no matter how much facts he would put and relay to kind of during the interviews about how Muslims are contributing to America and how, you know, that this Islamophobia is really rooted in kind of unfounded misunderstanding, ill understandings of Islam. He said that it's because Islamophobia is ultimately rooted in fear, and fear is impervious to data. So meaning I'm standing in front of a group of people here who are educated, they probably are read, et cetera, et cetera. Perhaps, you know, the statistics that I'm showing you are making sense to you and sparking a light bulb, but for the general public, this does nothing. This does nothing. And so he called for a humanizing movement, which means we need now to see Muslims in positions that reflect their realities, not always being the terrorist on that show with the accent, for example, you know? And so that's what he called the Will and Grace moment, right? Just showing the everyday lives of Muslims and what they do and what they believe in. And so I'm arguing that the modest fashion movement was very much a part of the humanizing movement, of humanizing Muslim subjects, particularly here in the West. I mean, this was a global phenomenon, but my presentation is going to focus in the US. Now, what I'm trying to do here is disaggregate this term, Muslim woman, and if you notice, there's no space between Muslim and woman. This is Miriam Cook's concept of a monolithic, universal idea of what it means to be a Muslim woman. It's kind of the impression that we have, the very common impression in the Western imagination of the Muslim woman as being downtrodden, as being the caged virgins, as being oppressed, et cetera, and always serving as the linchpin of the otherized Muslim, you know, subject, right? And so what the modest fashion movement did was kind of disaggregate the monolithic Muslim woman and show the complexities of who they are, doing it through fashion. And so what we see just alongside 2014, 2015 that's happening while there's a spike in Islamophobia is Muslim women, and particularly here in the US, are fed up with the misrepresentation, right? Always being spoken about, but never to, correct? They are reclaiming their own narrative, and they're doing it through sartorial means. They're doing it through fashion. And what they're doing is they're representing a very individuated religious identity, one that is particularly theirs, not necessarily one that speaks for the general masses. Here's what Muslim women look like. No, it's here what I, as an American Muslim woman, interpret my religion to be and want to be represented as. And they do it through fashion. And they did it to an extent where they did not want to have to compromise their values to fit some sort of mold, or have to remove their headscarves or what have you to gain kind of the respect that they needed for their religious values and their traditions. And so what happened was that the mainstream market started to take notice of this. And as a result, mainstream markets started to cater to their sartorial needs. If wearing the headscarf would require long sleeves, high necks, to the floor hems. And so then the Western mainstream markets started to cater to them on every single level. Now, athletic wear, bridal wear, casual, evening, formal, etc., you name it. And so then we start to see this new wave of visibility. It's a new type of visibility. And H&M was actually one of the first to actually include a hijabi model. Her name is Maria Idrisi, in one of their campaign ads. And all of a sudden, then we start to see that this was a domino effect. Many other brands started to follow suit. We have Dolce & Gabbana just right after that releasing a hijab and abaya line. And now this is not just like a headscarf line where any woman can wear it. No, they called it specifically hijab and abaya, which means they're catering to Muslims. And also don't forget that this is a time where many corporations are even hesitant to align themselves with Muslims. But we're starting to see that kind of be pushed to the side. Of course, now I would be naive to not mention that there are capitalistic, intentions here, right? This is a highly, highly underserved, lucrative market, and it wasn't until they recognized the capacity of that market that they started to cater to Muslim women. We see Ibtihaj Muhammad, who became the first U.S. athlete to compete in the Olympics with hijab, and also then Mattel, the toy company that owns Barbie, created a Barbie out of her, right? That would have never, ever happened 10 years ago, right? Yes, that's me with her over there, and you'll understand why later. Anissa Hasabwan. Then we start to see modest fashion and Muslim women gain recognition on some of the most coveted runways in the world, which is New York Fashion Week, right? There was an entire collection that debuted by Anissa Hasabwan, who is an Indonesian fashion designer, and she debuted her collection, and it really left a big splash. Rahaf Khatib, who now we start to see American Muslim women donning the headscarf, being on the cover of magazines, right? And you'll see. Halima Aden also, who really is the Tyra Banks of in the Muslim world, not just the Muslim world, like the Muslim sphere, in that she became a Muslim supermodel in her headscarf. She was the first actually to participate in the Miss Minnesota USA pageant, and she gained popularity because during the swimsuit competition she wore her burkini, so she was entirely covered from head to toe. And now Kanye West is, she's one of the main models for Kanye West's collection, and she's, all over the main magazines, from Vogue to, just really, really making a splash. Linda Sarsour, of course, as we know, Palestinian American political activist, one of the main leaders of the Women's March in Washington. Noura Afia. So this is the first time that CoverGirl chose a Muslim a woman in her headscarf to represent, to be one of their ambassadors for their line. And you see the line here that says, hijabis entering the makeup market. I'm being facetious with this line here. Hijabis can wear makeup, and it's the idea that this is something, the idea that they were, just became fashionable is also inaccurate. They have always been fashionable, but it's not that until the Western markets caught on to it that now this became in vogue, right? So we need to recognize that. Muslim women have been doing this. They've been in these spheres. They just haven't had the proper type of platform, and nor were they ever included. Nike Pro Hijab, this was a big one. Nike released a hijab line for Muslim athletes. Now, the great thing about this was, it wasn't like American Eagle that released a denim hijab that was so heavy and that most women wouldn't wear because it's so heavy and they'll sweat and what have you. They actually recruited Muslim athletes and said, what are your issues when you're working out in your headscarf? How can we solve that? Does this fabric work? Does this, do you see what I'm saying? So they're actually taking into account the struggles of Muslim women in Muslim athletes. Even in tween fashion, this was a huge thing. Even in tween fashion, we are seeing that they're including young Muslim women in headscarves. I mean, generally, the narrative is that she's oppressed and she's forced to wear this headscarf. But now that's kind of being flipped on its head, right? Ultimately, the modest fashion movement, I mean, if we have a minute, it would be great to show this, but I myself am very, very, very much involved in this movement, and I'm one of the leading influencers for the modest fashion movement in the US, where I host the largest modest fashion convention. And I did this out of the same reasons why modest fashion became a thing, was because I too was so fed up with the way Muslim women are being represented, and then the lack of inclusion of Muslim needs in general Western culture. I don't think we have time for the video, but ultimately what this new visibility has done is shown that, number one, there is no monolithic type of Muslim woman. This idea of the universal Muslim woman doesn't really exist, and now we are reclaiming our narratives into our own hands, and doing it through very visible means, and allowing the general public to understand that we have our own identity, and we practice Islam, and I don't like to say we because it's like where am I coming from with the we, but ultimately that this is a group of women that have their own beliefs and their own ways of practicing Islam, and even when it comes to wearing the headscarf, there is various ways of doing it, and that has been historically the case throughout different cultures, throughout different areas in the world. There's never been one way to practice it. And so ultimately, it's because of the modest fashion movement that now Muslim women you walk down the mall and all of a sudden you see in the window displays a Muslim woman in that campaign. And that campaign ad wearing her headscarf, and that being the norm. Now also starting to assume these roles that reflect their realities. And some scholars have called, particularly Elizabeth Bukhar, have called this a transitional moment in Western culture. Now all of a sudden there's this inclusion, this wave of inclusion toward the female Muslim subject. And it very much has been propelled by the modest fashion movement. And so ultimately, what's one of the main takeaways? One of the main ways to kind of remedy. Before I mention that, you see how that with Islamophobia, the spike in Islamophobia, the modest fashion movement burgeoned, right, and it flourished, and created this shift in Western mainstream culture. But ultimately, this is all well and dandy, but this does not negate the fact that on the ground, there are women who are removing their headscarves every single day out of fear. There are women who are continuously being attacked. Their headscarves are being removed. They feel alienated. They feel that they are a target. And so one of the most powerful ways, and we actually saw this with the reaction to the Muslim bans, the amount of love and support from non-Muslims to Muslims, support at airports and in the streets, showing that, hey, there's a lot of hate, but guess what? There is love too, right? There is love, and there is support. And so what contact theory basically says is that when you create contact between groups, majority and minority groups, it, of course, reduces the amount of stereotyping, the amount of prejudice, the amount of discrimination, and you think what a basic, easy practice, but guess what? From the studies, we found that not many people practice this. So just getting to know, people from the group that's very different than yours will help kind of alleviate and eliminate the level of discrimination that these minority groups are experiencing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, that was great. It's painful not to ask questions immediately. Okay. Our next speaker is, I wish I knew the first name. Hi. Hi, Cheang. Remediating Asian America, the representational logic of capitalism and the camera in documentary fictions. Thank you.
Before I begin, I wanted to say a special thank you to Dr. David Brady from the School of Public Policy and Dr. Caroline Sloan from the Department of Economics. The conceptualization of this paper is indebted to Dr. Brady's interrogation of my understanding of the term abstraction during the seminar Responses to Economic Inequality, which pushed me to further refine my usage of the term. Furthermore, my paper's choice of text that depicts the period of gentrification in San Francisco, Manilatown, and Japantown was inspired by Dr. Sloan's presentation on the correlation between household income and zoning practices. My presentation today will follow the tradition in my field, which is to read from manuscript, but I'll try to sound as animated as I can. Okay. Here I come. The International Hotel was one of San Francisco's last affordable housing options for working-class Asian immigrants in the 1960s and 70s. Its position at the intersection between Manilatown and Chinatown and its ongoing role in providing affordable housing invested the building with symbolic significance for SF's migrant communities. When the hotel's new owner, the Four Seas Investment Corporation of Thailand, issued eviction notices to the building's elderly tenants in 1974, an uproar ensued. A host of civil rights organizations inside and outside of the Asian American communities mobilized a massive civil disobedience campaign to protest the evictions and the building's impending demolition. Because many of the protesters who sought to save the International Hotel joined forces with those involved in the anti-eviction movement and the civil rights movement, the International Hotel has been credited by subsequent generations of Asian American critics as a historic monument that unified the heterogeneous Asian American population under the political goals of anti-racism and anti-capitalism. But important as the affinities between these anti-hegemonic ideologies were and remain, they concealed differences. Indeed, factional rupture was a defining part of the history of the anti-eviction movement. As documented by historian Estela Habal's book, San Francisco International Hotel, Mobilizing the Filipino-American Community in the Anti-Eviction Movement. Reflecting on her participation in the campaign to save the I Hotel, Habal recalls cases when the Asian American coalition fall apart, instances when the relations between Asian American protesters turn from solidarity to enmity. As Habal notes, the anti-eviction movement may have appeared as a united front when observed from a distance, but in fact it was an alliance made up of different factions, with each group motivated by different priorities. Some leftist revisionary factions within the group, like Iwo-Chen, were happy to see the tenants evicted because they expected the evictions to create a public outcry that would put pressure on the government to make changes to the city's housing practices. While for other organizations, like the Union of Democratic Filipinos that Habal, the historian, was part of, members were just concerned about the Manons and they just wanted to ensure the Manons had their everyday life necessities and things to be taken care of during and after the eviction. But what are the benefits of emphasizing intra-group differences within the discourse of Asian American studies that is founded upon alliance building? Recent scholarship by Susan Koshy, Stephen Yao, and Colin Lai helped me to generate an answer that forms the basis of the part of my dissertation chapter which I'm sharing with you today. This cohort of scholars' work are concerned with the inadequacy of existing analytics that solely focus on racial difference and resistance as the basis of Asian American politics, especially in reflecting the reality of the Asian American experience that is increasingly heterogeneous, not only in terms of ethnicity, but also in terms of class background. Their recommendation is to taxonomize differences. My dissertation, from which this chapter is extracted from, take seriously this exhortation to rethink Asian American cultural politics in comparative and intersectional ways by analyzing the literature and historiography of the International Hotel. My intention is to taxonomize Asian American hybridity in aesthetic terms by offering up the genre analytic of what I call Asian American documentary fiction. In my chapter, I chart out the lesser-known genealogy of documentary fiction from works by genre scholars including Leonora Fleece and Barbara Foley. In doing so, I identify a common philosophical underpinning in the narratives these scholars label as documentary fictions, namely that they all reflect upon the violence of abstraction, a process that, according to Marx, subjects an individual or a thing to training, molding, packaging, among other mechanisms of homogenization for transforming it into an exchangeable good. When tracing the genealogy of the genre, I note that existing scholarship on documentary fiction is not without its problems, in particular in its neglect of the visual context which the word documentary references. My conceptualization of documentary fiction is one that builds on and departs from follies and fleas to refer to hybrid narratives that fuse fictional prose and film scripts for a more fine-grained encapsulation of Asian American lives within and beyond the logic of economic abstraction. For today's presentation, I'm going to illustrate that analytic by using it to read Karente Yamashita's novella 1969, I Spy Hotel, and to argue that Yamashita inscribes the logic of abstraction onto the representational logic of her hypothetical camera as she transgresses genre boundaries, and uses those aesthetic transgressions to make comments about the material dynamics that stratify Asian Americans within the group. 1969 I Spy Hotel is made up of 3 installments. 2 of them, dossier number 9066 and A Need to Know Basis, are scripts of surveillance videos made by government agents who are spying on ex-internees and radical activists. The 3rd installment, Record Live in Your Face, which is the focus of my presentation, is a script of the documentary made by the character Judy Ng in dedication to her friend. On the page, Recorded Live in Your Face is composed of 17 bullet points, with each containing a prose description of the setting in which Judy made her film, followed by a script of a scene that her camera captured. Recorded from a participant observant perspective, Judy's documentary shadows the life of UC Berkeley student activist James Baba, known to his friends as JB. JB is a dynamic documentary subject. His role in the group Citizen Against Nihonmachi Eviction and the conflicts in the group arising out of different approaches to negotiating capitalist exploitation in the community highlights the way capitalism subverts and complicates Asian American coalitional politics, and more specifically, the way the scarcity of capital shared among Asian American activists makes them competitive against each other. Judy chooses James Baba as her object of investigation because he is a representative subject, or what Foley would call the conceptual abstraction of a group of student activists who found sudden empowerment in their vocal boycott against all authorities during the long 60s. Read on the surface, JB's rise on campus may appear unrelated to capitalism, and might even mark him as an outsider to the system. But if we take Asian American critic Mark Cheang's work into consideration, JB's radicalism comes to seem to be a product of a few that fits into capitalistic competition on campus. As Cheang notes in his book, The Cultural Capital of Asian American Studies, the Asian American activist community was originally considered to be the entity which possessed the cultural capital of Asian America. But because the radical elements of the community sought to shut the university down, a move incompatible with the university's mission to open up to diverse cultures and peoples for academic exchange, those radical elements were eventually purged from the institution and were replaced by representatives of Asian America by academics. This replacement consequently created and continues to create problems around the ethics of representation, raising the fundamental question of who owns the cultural capital of Asian America. Judy's film here tells a version of the story by capturing the tug-of-war for power between Professor Thomas Hisagi Takabayashi and his students in the course Asian American Experience at UC Berkeley. The film depicts a particular moment in the Asian American Studies class, held by a guest lecturer, and the guest lecturer's name is a noted professor in psychology. His name is Professor Harold Haas. During Haas' lecture, students interrupt him twice. The first time to accuse Haas's book of appropriating Japanese culture, and the second time to indict Haas for stereotyping Asian people by applying his research about the Japanese in Japan to the study of Japanese Americans. Psychology, an overgeneralization that is actually committed on the student's part, not Haas's. The crowd of students further yelled the epithet racist at Haas by drawing unfounded inferences from his book. The episode culminates with JB and fellow classmates ushering the visiting lecturer, Professor Takabayashi, and the guest lecturer Haas away from the podium while chanting, "Say it loud, I am black and I'm proud." JB's motives in participating in activism and his legitimacy in later claiming self-determination on behalf of racial minorities and the third world people are brought into question by Judy's film. Zooming in on a slip of paper that Judy picked up near the Sethard Gate of UC Berkeley, Judy's camera shows a flyer with words in bold writing, "Support the self-determination of third world people." Below it is printed a raised black fist. As the camera pans to the picket line, there is JB leading the Third World Liberation Front, demanding special treatments with 3 goals that are directly related to the university's allocation of capital. First, as you can see from the slide, it reads, the recruitment of third world people into positions of power. Second, special admission and financial aid for third world people. And third, third world people controlling third world programs. As is obvious from the final goal, the Liberation Front is not agitating for liberation for all the people in the third world as it claims, but demanding that the university redistribute resources and cultural capitals to the protesters. Though whiteness is absent in the scene, its presence is announced by the leader's desire for power to own, which, according to critics like Susan Koshy, is the metamorphosis of whiteness. As Koshy reminds us, whiteness takes many guises, including subject effects, or the illusion of possessing white privilege by acting white. Koshy further specifies that, quote, the emergence of the resistant Asian American political subjects of the 1960s was a reverse articulation of the subject effects issued by whiteness. As they claim for self-determination, the resisting subjects of color are not necessarily disarticulating the white power structure, but rather demanding to be empowered by it. Their resistant subjectivity is a re-articulation of white subjectivity because it is pronounced in repulsion against and at the same time in attraction towards the desirability of white subjectivity. Seen from this light, the third world protest leaders' demand here are telling instances of his aspiration to be equipped with white subjectivity, particularly particularly with a power to own, that which defines white subjectivity in the history of law. The allocation between the collaboration between the Liberation Front and whiteness come out like a slip of the tongue during a chorus of chanting. Captured amidst the chanting, Judy's film offers up a snapshot as follows. So a student organizer chants, "I'm brown and I'm proud," and then the crowd responds, "I'm brown and I'm proud." And then the student organizer continues to chant, "I'm red and I'm proud," and the crowd responds by saying, "I'm red and I'm proud." And then the student organizer chants, goes on, "So let's hear it from my people, I'm yellow and I'm proud." The crowd responds, "I'm yellow and I'm proud." The student organizer chants, "I'm white and I'm proud." The crowd responds, "I'm white and I'm proud." Then someone from the crowd says, I ain't white. Do I look white?" The other person then responds, "One drop, man, one drop is all it takes. You got a drop, don't say you don't." The student organizer then goes on regardless, saying, "I'm bourgeoisie and I'm proud." The crowd, with laughter and sporadic yells and hoots, says, "I'm bourgeoisie and I'm proud anyways." The humor in these exchanges arrests the discrepancy between the third worldism, basically questions like what third world Liberation Front means, right? The humor in these exchanges arrests the discrepancy between what third worldism means and how it practiced outside of the third world countries, in this case on Berkeley's campus. According to the chant, the third world is an imagined community comprised of a coalition of people from all races and classes. The irony of such conceptualization is that it equates experience of Black, Asian, Indian, and white peoples in the US as one and the same, while the third world actually refers to undeveloped countries unaligned to communism or anti-communism. By encapsulating the students' activist confusion, Judy's film warns the audience of the danger of the logic of instantiation and the slippages that it will create. Student activists like JB's false equivocation between racial experiences continue to undo attempts at achieving solidarity within the Asian American community later in this episode in iHotel. A late scene in the documentary shows JB claiming to be the spokesperson of the Japantown community, flaunting his anti-capitalist ethos of third worldism against the development company representing the Nihonmachi renovation, which eventually leads to the fallout between Japantown Collective and the citizens against Nihonmachi evictions. The aggressive extremity of student activists like JP provokes in-group conflict. Judy's film illustrates this by taking a participant observer perspective to show JB as he moves between multiple Asian American activist groups and come into conflict with all of them. With the scripts of those scenes, Yamashita, the author of this documentary fiction, through her character Judy's camera, reframes the emergence of Asian America from an organic process into a capitalistic one where clashing personalities and organization came into conflict for newfound cultural and economic institutional capital in the aftermath of the civil rights movement. Thank you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to get to introduce the next series of speakers. Two of them of the next three were in our working group together on contested histories. So first up, it's going to be Evan Suda, who's a grad student in the history department, giving us so working through mission systems. And I have to say, I was so glad Evan got to be in our working group, because I had emailed him and I said, Evan, do you want to do this? And he was like, yes. And then I'm like, oh, there might not be room. And I was like, I spent all summer threatening, and then there was, and I was just so delighted to hear your contributions and to get to participate in this group. So thank you.
Probably should have printed this out, huh?
Save paper, it's good.
I'll just move this like this and not hit it. Okay. Okay. Should I wait, or can I just start playing? Okay, well, thank you for introducing me, and thank you to everyone that was part of the seminar with me. It was great learning experience, and this is a learning experience. I've never been at a conference before, so I'm just going to give it a shot. I'm basically just going to read. Can you all hear me? Okay. This paper seeks to more fully encompass Southern California illegitimacy within similar studies of illegitimacy elsewhere in the Spanish-American colonial empire. Amidst this reframing, this paper will also use a decolonizing lens to challenge the colonial archive and perhaps tease out further means for historians focusing on Alta California to better understand the various intimate relationships which existed. In terms of temporal scope, the focus begins in 1769 with the founding of the first Southern California mission through Mexican independence, and ends in 1850 with the incorporation of California into the United States. Such a study will, however, require some discussion of the preceding historical factors, which, when in the practice of illegitimacy in the Spanish Americas. Now, what do I mean by illegitimacy? Here I'm referring to a socio-political label for a child born outside of the religious or civil institution of marriage. Those born within this sanctified union were conversely legitimate. In Spain and in the Spanish Americas, it was the Catholic Church which controlled the ceremony and therefore the institution for much of this period. This strong grasp has been used by scholars to explain how the low levels of reported illegitimacy in indigenous communities, which were closely guarded by the moralizing Franciscan priests of Alta California. Further complicating the matter, the Spanish maintained complex gradations of illegitimacy, ranging from hijo natural, a term referring to a child of a couple who might be able to marry, in which case would legitimate the child automatically, or adulterino, a term referring to at least one of the parents being married to someone else, and fortanizos, a term referring to a child of related parents. Unless otherwise specified, I will simply be referring to the collection of these various kinds of illegitimacy as a collective unit. And I'm trying to make sure that I signpost. So I will now offer a quick summary of the historiography which addresses illegitimacy in the Americas. Early modern European historians, most notably Edward Shorter in 1973, have taken special notice of the dramatic rise in illegitimacy beginning in the 18th century and have attributed this to a rising tide of individuality and liberal attitudes towards sex. Early modernists focusing on the Americas tied illegitimacy to anti-miscegenation laws and a concern for inheritance patterns as a result of the influx of African slaves to the British and French North American colonies. Notable examples are works by Daniel Scott Smith, Robert Wells, and Matthew Gerber. In many ways, the Spanish American colonies mimicked the larger trend of linking race and illegitimacy. However, Spanish colonial historians have traced their historical antecedents to the limpieza de sangre, or blood purity, of the Iberian Peninsula, subsequent to the Reconquista and the expulsion of Jews and Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula. The book I found most helpful in digesting this part of research was Public Lives and Private Secrets, Gender, Honor, Sexuality, and Illegitimacy in Colonial Spanish America by Anne Twynham. And I might be saying her last name wrong, so I apologize if she sees this on the recording sometime. Spaniards were deeply concerned that innate Jewish or Muslim proclivities might be contained in the blood of individuals of dubious parentage. Eventually, in the Americas, in the absence of numerous Jews and Muslims, these imagined proclivities migrated onto the indigenous population there. Therefore, charges of illegitimacy or uncertain pedigree were seen as a charge of possible racial impurity. And for those with the label of illegitimate, that meant greatly diminished inheritance rights, a bar on their ability to hold most civil offices, and a complete ban on holding religious office. However, as Twynham points out, and I'm paraphrasing, the stigma was less problematic for lower-class Spaniards and more problematic for those in the elite sections of the Spanish American society. It was also the Spanish American elites who were both able and compelled to petition for their legitimation through the courts. And for many of the same reasons, and this is what I see in my case study of Southern California, the indigenous people of Southern California seem to have been unaffected by their illegitimacy status. Even in instances where Spanish American men married indigenous women, there does not seem to be any discrimination between those women who were identified as illegitimate or those who were not. Many of the same patterns you see in both groups happen at the same rate. The above-mentioned works have focused solely on European Spanish and Spanish American understandings of legitimacy and illegitimacy as they related to the Christian institution of marriage. When it had been left out, what has been left out are the ways that the various indigenous groups of Southern California would have understood such a concept, both prior to the arrival of the Spanish and after their arrival. In other words, the continuity and change of such an idea in these societies. And it is here, I argue, that a decolonizing methodology must be undertaken by colonial Californian scholars. In my discussion of decolonizing methodologies, I rely heavily on the work of Linda Smith's Decolonizing Methodologies, Research in Indigenous Peoples, in which she describes a process of continually pushing back against Western-centric research practices and the archives that were steeped in those same historical conditions that developed those same research practices. She stresses the need for Indigenous scholars and those who do research with Indigenous people to reposition knowledge within Indigenous cultural practices. And again, a key distinction is that scholars are doing work with Indigenous people rather than studying Indigenous people. As an example, the largest body of primary source texts from this period in colonial California are the sacramental registers maintained by the Franciscan missionaries who operated the 21 missions across Alta California. These men were absolutely meticulous. In their quest to spread the Catholic faith, this small cadre of missionaries kept detailed records, or registers, in which they noted information relating to the people on whom they performed the Catholic rituals of baptism, marriage, and burial. In total, they oversaw the notation of over 200,000 records, which documented over 200,000 single moments in the lives of these individuals. However, each of these moments takes the dynamic life of an individual and violently bends it into a condensed, easily repeatable formula saturated in only those Western thoughts which the Franciscan deemed most important for their goals. Such ideas may have no easy parallel in the worldviews of the Indigenous person they characterize. For instance, in an in-depth philological study of the languages of Central Mexico, as best exemplified by James Lockhart and his numerous students, has been particularly illuminating in investigating the cultural worldviews of Indigenous groups there. Scholars have been able to compare, for example, early pictorial writings from Nahua-speaking people in the Valley of Mexico, which discuss pre-Columbian marriage practices with alphabetic texts from the 18th century, which had assumed more Catholic character. In other words, early Nahua-speaking people had their own conceptions of marriage and writing that were similar enough to that of the Spanish that through a process of syncretism in time, practices and understandings of marriage and written language changed. In a similar philological survey of 5 Southern Californian indigenous language dictionaries based off of early confessionarios and ethnographic work carried out by the Franciscans, not a single dictionary contained an indigenous translation of the word legitimate or illegitimate or the word bastard. Of these same 5 dictionaries, all contain the translation of the word child, but they didn't contain any derivative of the word child, which would have indicated some type of illegitimacy. While such an approach does not rule out the possibility that some of the numerous Southern California languages had a word to designate some idea that was similar to the idea of illegitimacy, it does rule out an easy assimilation of the idea from Spanish society into the major language groups of Southern California. Through the use of oral histories preserved by many of the indigenous groups in the area, it would be entirely possible to carry out the same kind of change over time analysis that was carried out in the Valley of Mexico. Relying heavily on this kind of indigenous knowledge offers a way forward for California historians. And then, hopefully, I've tried to cut it down so I didn't go over. So I'd like to leave you with the closing from a line in a review of Ann Twinham's work, Public Lives, by an anthropologist, Linda Seligman. And again, I probably pronounced that wrong also. One gets little sense of how indigenous men and women shaped and challenged the mores and practices of the elite and the institutions they established. In part, the scarcity of available archival sources that either directly or indirectly address these questions hinders these kind of research agenda. But I would challenge, and this is no longer the quote, this is me. But I want to challenge California historians to think past the limited and constrained archives created and directed by European or European Americans, to work with and to evaluate oral history, to analyze indigenous languages, and to recognize the knowledge of indigenous communities and indigenous scholars, Scattered throughout these various sources, a careful scholar can pick out the unmanipulated lives of living people.
We're going to continue with some of the themes of decolonization and thinking about methodologies when we hear the next speaker, Carly. Carly Maris in the History Department, who's also a grad student in the History Department, and will be presenting on the deconstruction as decoloniality in ancient Roman religious monuments in Syria and the Western Gaze. So time periods in the life of really thinking about methodology. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to sign into yours? Just put it up on your slide.
Yeah, I could do that, sure.
Is it in your slide file?
Yeah. Or I sent it to yours too, so it should be available. Sorry, I threw together a very last-minute slideshow. I can also just pull up other things. So while that gets set up, I'll just say that in the seminar, my dissertation is on Roman imperialism in West Asia. And as I finish my dissertation right now, this paper sort of stands as a postscript to a lot of the issues that I was thinking about in the ancient world and sort of how we today are become connected with the ancient world. So let me just log in here. Let's see. Sorry. Oh my gosh, okay. Yes.
Trust me.
But you feel very safe, don't you?
You know, safe enough.
It opens it up anyway.
Yes. Okay, cool.
Any questions for you?
Okay, I'll just go to slides. This is like a hard keyboard to use. Okay. There we go. Okay.
Yay.
Just do that. All right. Okay.
I would use the arrows if I were you.
Great. Okay. In 2015, Islamic State militants took dynamite to the temples and edifices of the ancient city of Palmyra, also called Tadmor, in central Syria. The destruction followed the murder of retired archaeological director of the site, 81-year-old Khalid al-Assad, who was killed because he refused to divulge information on the whereabouts of buried ancient objects. After Assad was murdered, the sites were looted so that portable antiquities might be sold on the black market, and the edifices were demolished. The physical damage done to the ancient site was massive, resulting in the destruction or displacement of around 400 objects from the Palmyra Museum, the demolition of a number of larger monuments, including the lion statue of Athena, the Temple of Baal-Shamin, the cella and surrounding columns of the Temple of Baal, the Triumphal Arch, as well as 3 columns in the main colonnade. Today, I analyze the history of the Temple of Baal-Shamin, placing the edifice not only in its ancient historical context, but examining the site more broadly through the lens of the Western gaze and its destruction as evidence for violent decoloniality. First, I argue that since the temple's reconstruction in 131 CE, the edifice has been evidence of Western presence in and influence over West Asia. Second, I argue that efforts to preserve these temples continue to play into a Greco-Roman-centric perception of the ancient past. Lastly, I read the destruction of the site as a reaction to perceived Western and secular imperialism, and borrow from discussions pertaining to decoloniality and the museum. Ultimately, I hope to show today how Western imperialism has shaped the site of Tadmor since the Roman era, and that the destruction of the site by the Islamic State can be read as a violent reaction to this long history of imperialism. The site of Syrian Tadmor has been populated since the Bronze Age and had connections with the Assyrian and later Seleucid empires. It is identified as a caravan city located at a central node within a major trade routes between Europe, Africa, and Asia. The city was a stopping place for many merchants and travelers from various parts of the world, resulting in a multi-ethnic and multicultural cosmopolitan environment. The identification of the city of Tadmor as Palmyra first comes to us in Greco-Roman sources, following the Roman conquest of the region, and it is the name that continues to dominate how scholars and the public refer to the ancient site. Palmyra first came under Roman control during Pompey's conquest of West Asia in the 1st century BCE, after which Syria became established as an official Roman province. At this time, Romans were interested in expanding their empire into the east and maintained their interests through a series of local negotiations with cities, battles, and setting up strategically located military colonies. It is from this point forward that Romans thus impacted the visual landscape of the city of Palmyra by erecting religious and civic monuments, including the Temple of Baal-Shamim. And I will go. Oh my gosh, you guys, I'm really sorry. This is the wrong slide. Whatever, okay. I'll just leave it. You can Google Temple of Baal-Shamim. It looks really cool. It's one of my favorite ancient temples. Okay. So the temple I am discussing today, it's really embarrassing. The temple I'm discussing today is one of the major sites that provides information about the ancient sky god Baal-Shamim, who is identified in later Greek sources as Zeus. Earliest evidence for ancient worship of the god dates back to the 7th century BCE in Tyre. And according to scholar A. Smith, his identity as a god, quote, can be characterized as a supreme deity with cosmic dimensions. The material record indicates that worship of Baal-Shamim entered Tadmor around the 2nd century BCE, right at the beginning of Roman expansion into West Asia, but just predating Roman presence in Syria. The first temple, built on the site in 89 CE, follows the construction of the larger Temple of Bel, which was likely built with imperial funds. However, the edifice was destroyed by ISIL in 2015, dates to 131 CE, and indicates that the rebuilding effort was done to emphasize local relations with the Roman emperor. Not only does the date follow Emperor Hadrian's visit to the city, but an inscription inside specifically makes reference to Hadrian. The inscription also notes that the construction was financed by a man named Male Agrippa, a member of the local elite who claims credit for overseeing Hadrian's visit to the city, and thus acting as the local official maintaining friendly relations with the Roman emperor. In rebuilding the temple, Male Agrippa asserts his own political power by demonstrating his ability to work with the emperor, and thus reaffirms Roman authority in the territory. The temple housed local religious ceremonies. However, it did so in a visually Greco-Roman space, and thereby reinforced Roman ideologies over the local religious landscape. The evidence for local religious worship comes primarily from inscriptions inside the temple, which were written in Aramaic, Greek, and Latin, and recorded honors given to specific deities. Other than the god Baal-Shamim, there was also an inscription dedicated to Rahim, as well as the god Fortune of Yedabel, thus demonstrating that multiple gods from around the region were worshipped alongside one another in the space. Additionally, inscriptions inform us about a fundamental feature of local cult worship, banqueting. While much remains unknown about banqueting, there are several elements that demonstrate it fostered a shared communal atmosphere in cult worship. Banqueting in the temple also appears to have embraced unity among a variety of ethnic groups residing in Palmyra at the time, as is evident in the presence of Aramaic and Arabic names on the same inscription. While the Temple of Baal-Shamim honors multiple gods who originated in Eastern territories and was the site of local cult practices, the architecture of the edifice, particularly after the reconstruction, was visually influenced by Greco-Roman temples, complete with a pronaos, which is a vestibule at the front, and that's standard of Greco-Roman temples, 6 Corinthian columns, which are the type of columns that we find in the Pantheon in Rome. And what this demonstrates is that although local customs and gods were celebrated inside the temple, this space itself visually reinforced Greco-Roman cultural hegemony that resulted from Roman imperialism in the territory. Local gods and religious worship were certainly permitted in Palmyra at the time, but happened in a Roman-controlled and influenced space. Thus, the edifice of the Temple of Baal-Shamim was itself a monument to Roman imperialism in Syria. Alongside a number of other monuments, also from the Roman era, the temple helped create a visual landscape of the city that was marked with physical reminders of Roman hegemony. 20th and 21st century heritage efforts, moreover, help preserve this Roman-centric perception of Syrian heritage, and is thus worth analyzing through the lens of the Western gaze. Sheila Burney defines the Western gaze as an imagined reality substituted with pictures, perceptions, and perspectives derived from a hegemonic Eurocentric perspective, which subjectifies and objectifies all that it sees in its own image through its own colored lens and from its own position of power. Palmyrean heritage efforts play into a perception of the ancient world that emphasizes the glory of and expanse of Rome into the East, rather than specifically Syrian or local heritage, inscribing the importance of the territory in respect to a European past. By using the name Palmyra instead of referring to the site as Tadmor, such efforts make clear that the impetus is to remember Roman history. Preservation efforts were largely funded by Europeans in the 20th century, and a statement released by the UNESCO director states, quote, Palmyra represents a unique relic of the 1st century AD and a masterpiece of architecture and Roman urbanism, with its famous colonnaded Main Street and the Temple of Baal, one of the most important cultural monuments of the entire region. Additionally, preservation efforts since the destruction of the site have tended to focus on Roman history, and in so doing, ignore current violence and other periods of history from the site. A study done by archaeologist Zina Hamash asks members of the public viewing a full-size recreation of the Palmyrean Arch in the Trafalgar Square in London to supply anonymous reactions to the recreation via postcards. While 58% of those who responded had positive reactions, critical responses focused on the humans impacted by the violence. This included calls for spending money assisting those who were displaced instead of recreating ancient monuments, and noting the location of the arch as part of a colonial project. Quote, it's very westernized, a Western portrayal and importance on stuff. For those who were directly impacted by the violence, a large public display of this nature invoked pain. Quote, I'm from Syria. It's so painful to say, a memory from your country has been destroyed and rebuilt somewhere else. Stop the war. 5 years of pain is enough. Thus, 20th and 21st century heritage projects can be seen as part of a larger history of Western imperialism in the site that focuses on a Roman-centric past. In this light, the destruction of Palmyra and other ancient sites by Islamic State militant groups is rooted in neo-colonial tensions and can be read as evidence of violent decoloniality. Recent critiques of museums created in colonial contexts have adopted terminology of decolonization and decoloniality, which is roughly defined as entailing, quote, the radicalization of certain premises of post-colonial critique. It also takes the failures of decolonization, more specifically, its repercussion by institutions of globalized neoliberalism as its condition of possibility. While scholars and curators today seek ways to decolonize museums, the actions on site in Syria and in the Middle East address these colonial tensions through violence. This is particularly evident from an ISIL propaganda video released during the destruction of the Mosul Museum, in which a representative states that the ruins are, quote, idols and statues that people in the past used to worship instead of Allah. When God orders us to remove and destroy them, it becomes easy for us, and we don't care, even if they cost millions of dollars. In the video, shots of museum labels with English translations of the objects on display provide B-roll footage during the man's monologue. A song that the Western press have only described as, quote, Islamic, provide a soundtrack for the destruction. Men wearing a variety of clothes, some sporting jeans and cotton t-shirts, take sledgehammers to statues, and slow-motion shots emphasize the falling of particularly large objects, while the music in the background crescendos with the sounds of war, of guns firing, and people shouting. The focus on the museum's display labels in the ISIL video and the destruction of the museum is evidence of the ultimate rejection of Western structures. Rather than taking a, quote, secular approach to viewing these ancient objects, the narrator of the video makes clear that ISIL militants have reinscribed the meaning and value of the objects within a religious, Salafi-driven worldview. It is a worldview that sees ancient objects not as they are displayed in museums as relics of a distant and disembodied past away from a religious present, but rather as idols that stand in conflict with worshiping Allah. by reinscribing or casting a new meaning upon the objects in the Mosul Museum with new types of knowledge that challenge or exist outside of Western imperial models, ISIL violently decolonizes the structures in place. In this light, the demolition of the temples of Bel and Balshamin, like the destruction of the Mosul Museum, sent a similar message about rejecting ancient history and Western museum models. Ultimately, what I hope to show you today was how Western imperialism has shaped the site of Tadmor since the Roman era, and that the destruction of this site by the Islamic State can be read as a violent reaction to this long history of imperialism. While the objects destroyed by the Islamic State include those dating from the pre-Roman and Islamic eras, global efforts to preserve the site have tended to focus on Roman monuments, which are themselves monuments of Western imperialism over Syria. They preserve a vision of the East that was under Western control and display Western power. Through the Temple of Balshamin, a god of non-Roman origins becomes preserved in history within a Greco-Roman space. Moreover, preservation efforts tend to ignore the very real violence experienced by people living in the area. I thus end my talk by proposing the following question. Can we lessen violence in the territory by rethinking our relationship with the ancient past and historical record in Syria and beyond? As an ancient historian, I hope the answer is yes, but I believe that doing so is rooted in acknowledging and critiquing the history of Western imperialism in the territory. Thank you.
Of this really exciting panel, and it's kind of nice that you talked about sound, because this is where we're moving to next. So Kevin Sliwoski, who was in also my seminar on contested history, is going to give us a great presentation on sound and stuff, listening to the U.S. military infrastructure. And I got to say, it was so exciting to have someone with such different methodology in our conversations, because we were like, how do you do what you do? But it proved very influential in my work now. I'm trying to write about historical sound, thanks to Kevin. Thank you.
Thanks for the introduction. Good morning. I don't know about you, but I'm loving these really short, concise, tight presentations. I promise mine is on time. Between 1950 and 1970, U.S. Naval Base Subic Bay, located northwest of Manila in the Philippines, underwent a transformation. It grew from a destroyed and small coaling station into the Navy's busiest logistic, repair, and supply installation in the Pacific. Subic Bay became a strategic U.S. military outpost in part because of its proximity to the coast of Vietnam. The base's existing and growing industrial infrastructure became vital to that war effort. While the fighting in Vietnam dominated U.S. geopolitics in the region during the 1960s, the relationship between the United States and the Philippines was being negotiated constantly, often through the politics of sound and industrialization. So I'm interested in the sonic culture of this naval base during this time period. Specifically the sounds in this paper of the industrial areas, but I have other chapters about basically domestic sounds, suburban sounds, and commercial sounds would be the third way. And I'm asking, what is the relationship between military sounds and materials? How are they politicized? How can we listen to and interpret the sounds of the past? And can we hear the sounds of material production and the materiality of sound in itself, beyond sort of measuring in decibels and in frequency waves? To describe military industrial sounds, I'm introducing the term industrial sonic emissions. Industrial sonic emissions are the massive sounds produced by industrial infrastructure. They are sounds from disparate but adjacent sources that converge into a sonic force that pushes out into the surrounding environment. A focus on industrial sonic emissions provides analytical access to the sounds of materials and the sources of those sounds. And again, what I'm hoping to get at is sort of this materiality of sound itself, not in a hard science way, but perhaps through measuring it or studying it, reading it through culture in other ways. Because these kinds of sounds and sound materials stem from military industrial production, they might also be considered as unique political ecology of sound, one in which the sonic footprint of military production is considered as a collection of individual acoustic and material strains and as an uninterrupted whole. Sonic emissions address relationships between people, industry, infrastructure, and space, and describe how intersecting waves of sound inform epistemological worldviews. They also make audible the capitalist infrastructure of a particular economy, in this case of this naval base. Industrial sonic emissions are also related to other forms of environmental leakage, such as air pollutants, is the one I usually think of. Sonic emissions can be born of tightly controlled sound spaces like a radio transmitting site, or they can be raw and feral, spilling out from their points of origin not easily contained. The scale of sonic emissions means that control over them can be a futile endeavor. Such sounds can be present at any kind of industrial site, but are often defining characteristics during wartime, on and off of the battlefield, and of the US military broadly. When music scholar Martin Daughtry describes the collective sounds of generators that powered the US military occupation of Iraq, what he's called the industrialized soundscape, he is describing, I think, industrial sonic emissions. The generators helped to produce the war for US combat troops, powering camps and installations throughout Iraq. The generators were also used by Iraqi civilians who came to depend on such supplementary infrastructures because the US invasion ruptured Iraqi supply and infrastructural systems. As Daughtry points out, the sound of the generators became a familiar keynote sound for Iraqis, for whom the drones of the generators came to symbolize the American sonic and military occupation of Iraq. A similar understanding emerged for Filipinos and for Americans decades earlier in the Philippines. While industrial sonic emissions can be blunt, invasive forces, they can also become part of the scenery, familiar, non-threatening, and structural. Jonathan Stern has described this process as sonorial circulation, when music or sound becomes a form of architecture. Stern explains how music in shopping malls fills and creates infrastructure and environment. And he writes, rather than simply filling up an empty space, the music becomes part of the consistency of that space. The sound becomes a presence, and as that presence, it becomes an essential part of the building's infrastructure. Stern argues that as sound fills space, it assumes a new ontology in relation to its surroundings and to the listener's acceptance of that sound's presence. The music piped into shopping malls to create a comfortable consumer atmosphere doesn't just make shoppers more comfortable and therefore more willing to spend money. Music also ceases to be a distinct component of the shopping mall and instead becomes indistinguishable from the overall mall aesthetic. And as Stern argues, produces an audible infrastructure. Industrial sonic emissions at Subic Bay functioned in a similar manner. At the micro level of shop floors, industrial sounds formed part of that particular shop's culture and environment. Each shop did different work with different tools. So it'd be the difference between a machine shop, electronics shop, or a blacksmith shop, for instance. And at the macro level, the convergence of industrial sound blended into a larger structural sonic emission that characterized that particular area or section of the base, and also the neighboring communities that it bled into. Sonic emissions in the context of military bases are also related to what Mark Gillum calls the clamor of military base spillover. Clamor corresponds to sonic emissions in that they both express the extent to which military sounds ignore the physical limits of the bases they are located within. Clamor and sonic emissions both identify how sound is not easily bound, that its fluid nature ensures that sounds reverberate beyond their sources through and across space and across time. This also means that sonic emissions are more difficult to measure and document than other kinds of military emissions. Experts can take soil readings to measure chemical pollution. Police blotters and crime reports can be synthesized to create metrics and metadata. And the Navy actually kept records that detailed the ways in which the base's land changed through construction projects. But what is the best way to measure sound? How do we measure sound? The Navy's lack of urgency regarding sound measurements was driven in part by a disregard for sound's cultural and political impact on service members and on host nations and communities. And I was able to find out along the way in studying some of this that the Navy did contract out a number of basically noise surveys to measure bombing range decibel levels, and they were all subsequently destroyed when all the records moved to the National Archives around the 1990s. So they did measure sound. I don't know if it actually changed anything because you don't have access to those reports anymore. There may be some stuck in an administrative file somewhere, but so far I haven't been able to find one. Industrial sounds and infrastructures converged in several ways at Subic Bay. In the mid-1950s, the U.S. Congress appropriated military construction funds for the Navy to build updated and permanent communications infrastructure in the Philippines. These new facilities, a transmitter and a receiver station, were located at different ends of the base. The transmitter station was in the south of the base, and the receiver was in the north. The new Communications Command became the main military intelligence clearinghouse during the Vietnam War, a center for coordinating ship traffic, and it was also connected to the Vietnamese coast via undersea cables. The northern facility was also planned as the new Voice of America broadcast center for the whole region, which it became. The proposed site, which was approved, allowed for the installation of complete high and low frequency transmitting facilities, and the Navy believed that the area could be expanded for additional transmitting facilities should the need arise in the future, anticipating changes in communications technology already in the mid-1950s. The U.S. communications facility was able to cut through sovereign Philippine airspace for control over communication transmissions and radio frequencies. And although the Navy didn't find a need to buy or take additional land for the station's construction, they did reserve the right to construct antenna fields and to install transmission lines, roads, underground piping, and cables, so the stuff that is facilitating all of these communications, sounds of the communications. Radio frequencies and microwave links were also implicated in the politics of sonic industrialism at Subic Bay. In the years following the construction of the communications buildings, the Navy sought to expand its number of bandwidths and number of frequency lines used in the Philippines. Much of this had to be done through the Philippine Joint Radio Link Board, meaning the U.S. Navy needed approval from the Philippine government to expand its sonic transmitting capacity. A few years earlier, the Navy had been forced to return some of its megacycle bandwidths back to the Philippines so that that government could meet its own regulations and standards for television and broadcasting and communication speeds. As Subic Bay's infrastructure expanded and new installations were added, however, the Navy found that previously approved levels of bandwidth and designated frequency clearances were operationally insufficient, with naval communications suffering broadcasting time delays. So the main issue was that the real-time transmissions between an onshore command and to basically transmit instructions for ships moving through the sea was significantly delayed. And so that's why they were seeking to get more bandwidth. The issue persisted between both governments into the early 1960s, and U.S. naval leaders complained about the excessive time delays encountered in these meetings with the host government, the Philippines. Another way to think about the political ecology of sonic emissions at Subic Bay is to consider how sound was present yet neglected by U.S. naval leadership. In 1955, for example, the Navy sought congressional and DoD approval to contract with Standard Vacuum Oil for the construction of an oil refinery near the base. And this was a joint U.S. oil venture to control Philippine oil. The refinery was approved and construction began in 1957. It later came under control and was nationalized by the Philippine government in the 1970s. In a memo between two high-ranking naval leaders, they discussed how the potential oil refinery could produce, this is a quote, AV gas, MO gas, kerosene, automotive and industrial diesel, asphalt, and perhaps jet fuel. And those are all basically variants of either aircraft or automobile fuel for military vehicles. The possible oil refinery products revealed the vehicles and activities at Subic Bay needing that fuel. There were numerous aircraft, cars, and military vehicles driven on and off the base for personal, commercial, and military use. And there were strict curfew laws that limited driving hours so the Navy could monitor both sound and security. Although the Navy was not interested in the collective sounds of the base's motor pools and airstrips, local newspapers and ship yearbooks detailed the noise of the traffic around the base, the chaos of aircraft accidents and other explosions, and the sounds of labor and production related to supply logistics and transportation, the transduction of material into sound. In these examples, sound, space, and materials were all impacted in the expansion of overseas U.S. militarization. As the Navy built more facilities throughout the 1960s, they sought expanded control over signal and other kinds of intelligence, the airwaves, the frequencies, and the bandwidths, and the land around the communications buildings and the base. Listening to the base's history through sound shifts the focus to the impact of industrial production onto local culture and people, and away from the detached realpolitik that often characterized the views of upper U.S. military and political leadership towards the Philippines. There was an emerging politicization of sound in military, political, and diplomatic spheres. The Navy's production of industrial sounds affected the local environment, economy, and the changing sonic culture at Subic Bay was further impacted by growing Philippine nationalism, which led to anti-base, anti-nuclear, and anti-American activist and protest groups. The resistance to a continued U.S. military presence in the Philippines was a reaction partially in response to how industrial sonic emissions at Subic Bay shaped the sound worlds of the people who lived around the base. Sounds were never isolated. They were embedded in politics, economics, diplomacy, and culture, and were sounded through the materials of military industry. Thank you for listening.
Maybe we should ask these. I can share this one, I guess. So are there questions? Yes.
I have a question for Kai.
Yes.
Thank you for your talk. It was very interesting.
Thank you.
Articulated the abstraction in the colon response very, very nicely. And I wondered if at that moment the camera work also expressed a similar sense of abstraction and homogenization.
Thanks for the question. Like in the larger project, I'm trying to articulate a concept that is called representation without instantiation, meaning that there is like a heterogeneity of like senses that the camera is trying to capture, especially in the context of thinking about the heterogeneity of Asian Americans. I think Yamashita is trying to do like justice to the diversity of the group by focusing on what some critic may call the aesthetic of excess, like things that are not necessarily contributing to the linearity or the here and now of the image, but to the peripheral and to the flashbacks and like competing images. So I didn't have chances to talk about those, but definitely the call and response are in a way theatrical representations of the heterogeneity and the competitiveness of Asian American voices.
Great. Questions? Okay, I have one, if no one else does right now. Hassanah, the way you laid it out, it seemed that, and cited the statistics, it seemed that the increase in hate crimes began before Trump showed up on the scene. So it makes me wonder whether you think that maybe there's some trend that both produced Trump and then further, increased. There's a kind of geometrical progression or something. It's like, right? But maybe the impulse that perhaps produced Trump was also sort of at work in producing even more hate crimes before. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, we know ultimately that what politicians say has an effect on the general public. And so there's no doubt that a lot of what we saw leading up to the presidential campaign and during the presidential campaign was in large part as a result of that. I would say that the result of the presidential campaign was the normalization of over Islamophobia. But leading up to that, it kind of stabilized itself, though, in terms of the anti-Muslim hate crimes. There was, I don't know the exact numbers, but I remember seeing in the charts that, excuse me, that it was stable, and then there was a spike. And then in recognizing the spike, it had to do with the geopolitical climate, and then enter Trump, and of course then there's a spike in that. So I'm not sure that it's entirely as a result of the campaign, but definitely it was a huge part of it. But really, what we need to account for is the fact that Trump or no Trump, this is a reality on the grounds that Muslims are experiencing every single day. And when you look at the surveys that are conducted by so many different studies, the general public views Muslims in an unfavorable view. I mean, this is true since, even before 9/11, but particularly post 9/11. And so you see a lot of efforts on the side of the Muslims trying to become more politically involved, because that's something that they realized post 9/11, that they can no longer be silent in these in the political aspect and the social aspect, and you start to see that a lot of social activist groups coming to the fore and no longer just being silent, and that's why Muslim life now is accounted for. And when I say Muslim life, I'm talking about like all different categories of Muslim life. Why do we have Sharia compliant lending services in finances, right? Why when you go to Costco now you're seeing halal meat, not just kosher meat? Why there's a rise in Muslim life, and it's as a result of this generation, the millennials, essentially, fed up with the narratives that have defined their identity and their parents' identity, and just saying that, we're here to stay. I mean, we're just like you, and we need our values and our lifestyle to be accounted for just as you are. And it's making a big splash.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
I was once walking around campus about maybe 15 years ago, and there was a hamburger stand for a while. They were making fresh hamburgers for lunch, and I thought Muslims and Jews who are observant, can't eat there. So I got in touch with the administration thinking, we should do something about that. I mean, after all, if it's kosher, it's halal, right? So why don't we have some kind of service that would really serve the two populations? Observant Jews are, not a big population on campus, but anyway, it would be a great thing. And I got no response from the administration at the time, so that's that.
I thought you were going to say that there is halal, because I
Oh, they may be now.
maybe okay.
There isn't
Maybe that
kosher
was
there.
as a result of your
No.
complaint.
All right, Georgia.
I wanted to ask Kevin about, I don't really have a question, but I'm sort of intrigued by what seems to be a kind of rise in just sound studies. Is that true? And I was struck because I was listening to something on NPR, and there's like one place you can go in the United States and not hear any sound at all.
Whoa,
And you have to go everywhere else, there's sound.
where would that be?
You have to go, I can't remember where it is, you have to go hike in.
It's the middle of New York City, probably.
My question is, what does no sound sound like?
But what, so is your work part of a kind of rise in sort of sound studies?
I think we're at probably the peak of sound studies now, actually.
Oh, really?
I think that's how I think of it. And I think I'm at the edge of music at this point. I've pretty much committed to sound studies for this project, as much as it is a kind of history. And I think that this project in particular is part of a smaller subset of music scholars and sound studies scholars who have looked at militarization and military bases and all things related to the military in the past, say, 15 years, looking at music used in torture, music on battlefields, and things like that.
Yes,
Music is torture.
you're next.
Yeah, but I might have missed it, but I remember about 10, 15 years ago, there was a lot of problems with marine mammals being damaged and their navigational abilities, and whales washing up on shores, and they're apparently damaged by acoustics, underwater acoustics, mainly perpetrated by the U.S. Navy, to my knowledge. And do you have anything come up in your study about that?
No, I think that was not a part of anyone's study in the Philippines in the 1960s, but I expect that it's probably similar to what's happening down in San Diego County, which I think is still happening, but it's just there's better PR from the military about getting it out of the news.
She also had did you have a question? She had her hand up first. No, you're good? Okay.
Hello, my name is Cuauhtémoc. Thank you. Thank you, Evan, for bringing up some things about OR's initiation for indigenous work with scholars and collaboration. And towards that theme, I'm thinking also towards Carly and your ideas of decolonization and coloniality. And from my understanding in the Middle East, there's a lot of sort of colonization between tribes and overlapping colonization. And so I'm having a difficulty understanding what sort of, or what definition of colonization you're thinking about, and how that works, like the violence of colonialities of different empires or different tribes or different groups versus the violence of decolonization. If you could speak to that.
Yeah, so it's tricky to answer this question, and my project is a little bit tricky because you're sort of talking about colonization in the ancient world, and then also a different type of colonization, which is the modern world, right, the 20th and 21st century. So I'm understanding colonization in and of itself to be, in the modern context, a form of violence, a form of local erasure, and domination, especially European domination over this area. When it comes to Palmyra specifically, you have, again, like a lot of European groups that were funding the archaeological digs, and in so doing, kind of removing sort of local interests in various ways. So I guess decoloniality in the museum context is still kind of being defined, and still people, I think, are still figuring out how to decolonize the museum. And there's so many, is it possible? It might not even be possible, right? And so this, I sort of, when I was watching these propaganda videos released by ISIL, I was all sort of seeing it in this sort of like just removing these, colonial structures that were in place, right? But it's very violent removal. And then when you contrast that with these discussions in museum studies about decoloniality, it's trying to advocate this very peaceful, like, oh no, we're going to get local voices and maybe we're going to give objects back, or should we give it's a very stark contrast, but I think it's two different reactions to the same thing, which is this initial, movement from the West over the Middle East. I hope that answers that question.
We have time for one more question. Evan hasn't been asked yet, so can anybody interested, or else I'll have to do it. And I can't because I don't know what to ask, so you can do it.
Well, I had a question. I mean, I'm not smart enough to try to be able to pull all your panels together and come up with something, sort of a question for all of you. But one of the things that struck me was that this section is called impact. And actually 3 of you guys used the word reaction or response. And I just kept wondering about sort of the big frame of this is like the broadest possible question, I'm sorry. But like, Kai, you used the word reaction. And so you start thinking about what you're studying is response as opposed to individual production. What you're studying is response as opposed to individual production. What you're studying is response as opposed to, and so I kept thinking about if there's a way of framing or thinking about your your work, or are you also sort of trying to study impact and reaction as well as construction, or sort of where you see yourself in your project. And for you, Evan, I'm thinking this relates to sort of like you're trying to understand this impact of this thing, and you're sort of trying to read sort of the silence and the not production that you were expecting to find. I don't know if any of you want to take a stab, but that's what I was like trying to think about how that relates. And you all use this verb in really interesting ways.
Go for it.
Just kidding, I tried.
Long question or short response? Have you ever been to Grinnell Hall?
Well, let's take a 10-minute break.